on SRM governance, ethics, and Africa's role in global decision making. We have Professor Samuel Essien Baidoo with us. And before I get into an introduction to Prof. Essien, I do want to say we really want to encourage participation and this really being a conversation and a dialogue. So as the presentations are going on, as we're engaging, please feel free to use the chat to add in your questions, and we will have a Q&A session towards the end for at least 10 minutes. So we really want to hear from you as well. We really want to get your voices in. If we do have time to unmute and ask your questions as well, but please feel free to put those in the chat so we can get a queue going and we're able to prioritize your questions as we get towards the end of the session. And with that, I think we can get started. And I want to introduce Prof. Essien, who is an associate professor of laboratory medicine and a fellow of the West African Postgraduate College of Medical Laboratory Science, with expertise in pharmacovigilance, clinical trials, vaccine research, health law and ethics, regulatory science and health governance, and holds a postgraduate qualification in health law and ethics, which has shaped his career at the intersection of biomedical innovation, governance, risk management, regulatory oversight, and public health policy. His work increasingly extends to the governance of emerging technologies and complex societal risks. As an ethics and governance scholar, he's contributed to interventional discussions on the governance of solar radiation management, SRM, and climate intervention technologies, and co-authored the commentary Africa Must Lead the Governance of Solar Radiation Management in Nature Climate Change, which argues for stronger African leadership, participation, and governance in shaping the research, oversight, and policy framework surrounding SRM technologies. The commentary emphasizes the importance of justice, sovereignty, and inclusive decision making in addressing emerging global risks. Committed to health system strengthening, ethical leadership, and interdisciplinary collaboration, he works to advance resilient public health institutions, promote good governance in health and technological innovation, and support the development of regulatory systems capable of addressing current and emerging global health and societal challenges. Through his scholarship, teaching, and public engagement, he seeks to foster evidence informed, ethically grounded, and socially responsible approaches to innovation and risk governance. A very warm welcome and over to you, Prof. Samuel Essien Baidoo.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Kindly confirm if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Great. So permit me to share my screen also. Yeah, great. All right, thank you very much for the introduction. That was quite long, but thank you, and thank you to the team for inviting me to speak on this very important subject. I have quite a few things to share. I would run through what risk and uncertainties SRM brings, focus on the ethical and governance dimensions, identify who the key decision makers should be, and then talk about Africa, what we must do, our seat on the table, again, issues of our comparative advantages, how we can leverage that when it comes to the discussions on SRM. So that is how I'm going to attempt to tease our minds into a very elaborate and extensive Q&A, because I would want us to have a conversation. Yes. So to begin with, I'll say that we need to first of all understand the agency that drives the whole SRM conversation, and the statistics, the data is very clear. We're looking at global temperature rising above pre-industrial levels. We're looking at projected warming to a certain degrees and all of that. Again, the question for most people would be, why are we talking about climate interventions? Why are we discussing issues about climate interventions now? There are quite a number of things that are happening. For instance, emissions are still rising. There is also the widening adaptation gap. There's also mounting loss and damage when it comes to issues relating to the climate. But there are some questions that have been asked. For instance, if we attempt to mitigate all of this, what are the considerations that we have to make? What additional measures do we have to put in place? Now, the question also has brought into perspective the issue of SRM, especially into the policy discussions and then the governance frameworks on what we should do. Why are we doing this? What are the key questions that we need to answer? For those of us on the call who probably may not know what the whole concept of SRM means, just let me just quickly say that this is an attempt to, reflect a small fraction of the incoming solar radiation back into space, so that it can cause some desirable effect for us. The purpose basically is to attempt to reduce the global mean temperature and, reduce carbon dioxide concentrations and things like that. But obviously, you would also agree with me that when you look at SRM and other climate mitigation strategies, there is some slight difference because greenhouse gases would continue to remain in the atmosphere. Ocean acidification would continue, even though we may see some of these desirable effects that we're looking at. Now, what SRM does vis-a-vis what other emission reduction mitigation strategies do basically is to, what I say, treat the symptoms, but not the cause of the problem. Now, what this means basically is that yes, we can go ahead and deploy SRM, but we're not going to stop the emissions. We're not going to cut down on the emissions if we don't make a deliberate attempt to do so. And so SRM may not be an alternative to what mitigation strategies we should be looking at in terms of emission control and things like that. But potentially, it has a lot of good stuff to complement whatever we need to do in terms of these challenges that we face. Now, there are climate models that have projected what we should be looking at. Models suggest that SRM could offset warming, but again, the regional effects are very, very uncertain. We're not sure as a scientific community if we all agree to a very large extent what sort of research is needed, what data we should collect, what should inform the deployment strategies, who should start, who should continue, if we have systems put in place to monitor whatever adverse effects or uncertainties that may arise from the deployment. Now, I want to begin my presentation by talking about the uncertainty, which also poses risk. Now, if we talk about risk and uncertainties, for instance, we're looking at the fact that, look, SRM is good, but it poses a number of uncertainties, which I want to quickly avert our minds to. Now, if you look at the science, for instance, the impact regionally remain poorly understood because there are a number of models that are being worked on now. There are some disagreements on the effect on monsoons, on precipitations, and things like that. We're not so clear how that is going to happen. Now, anytime there is uncertainty about something, it brings about a risk. So uncertainty leading to risk means that you should put together governance strategies to avert the risk in the interest of the public. I'll take that again. Anytime there is an innovation, it could be a product, it could be service, it could be anything. Anytime there's an innovation, and through that innovation, you realize that there are some questions that are not answered, and that brings uncertainties about a number of things. Those uncertainties would pose what we refer to as the risk. Now, in mitigating risk, what you need is that you need to develop the appropriate governance frameworks that would prioritize the risk, monitor the risk, evaluate the risk, and then solve or mitigate them when they do arise. So you cannot have conversations about SRM, its deployment, and the uncertainties that surrounds it without talking about the risk that is inherent in it. Now, for instance, there may be effects on the ecosystems because we're not so sure what the deployment may mean. Changes in light and precipitation could disrupt biodiversity. If we look at the concept of One Health, for instance, where we're looking at the environment, we're looking at animals, we're looking at humans, the transmission dynamics and all of that may be affected in one way or the other. Again, as I mentioned earlier on, SRM is not intending to reduce carbon dioxide concentration. So the ocean acidification will continue, marine life will be threatened, and that obviously would affect food security. What we don't also know in terms of uncertainty, which poses another risk, is the long-term effect. So beyond, let's say, a decade, what are the consequences? A lot of work is being done scientifically. I know Kwesi and then the other colleagues are working on some modeling and all of that to understand what this long-term, short-term effects will look like. But then there's another uncertainty also. Should we begin this? And then we realize that no, the kind of results we are probably looking for is not what we're getting. So we decide that we terminate or we stop at some point, we truncate the entire process. Could that also lead to some other risk? This we do not know. Now, again, there are systemic issues, for instance, where we look at interaction with other earth systems, and we are unable to tell currently what cascading effects would be linked to different climate systems that are likely to bundle themselves together when we go into deployment. So scientifically, we haven't built consensus on SRM, and that uncertainty poses some risk that needs the development of governance framework so that we are thinking about the if it happens, what do we do? Before it even happens, what do we do? So we'll need quite a lot more research before we go ahead to deploy, because the unknowns far exceed the knowns if you look at the whole concept of SRM. Now, if we dial this back to the environment, for instance, we're talking about monsoon disruptions. Now, if you come to Asia and Africa, we rely so much on the climate. Our GDPs are almost tied to our climate. So our agricultural systems are likely to face severe disruptions. Now, if you look at the impact of the climate on on food security, you're talking about reduced yields during flooding or drought and things like that. You're looking at where some regions across the continent may become vulnerable because they may not have access to food and all of that. We cannot overemphasize that risk. Now, we talked about biodiversity, there's a lot of very, very diverse animals and plants across the continent that also survive or lend their life cycle to the climate, which is something that we cannot overemphasize. Obviously, we may not be able to look at issues of species adaptation, for instance, whether some plants or some animals may become extinct over time and things like that. We haven't really averted our minds to some of those discussions. I talked about termination shock, how it could affect Africa, uh, ocean systems, the issue of acidification and all of that, the depletion and all of that. But again, colleagues, what is important to note is that in all of these discussions about the science, the environment, there is also the socio-political risk, which for me is the major issue that we need to avert our minds to. Now, there is a moral hazard. For instance, could SRM reduce incentives for mitigation? The evidence is mixed. Some argue that it could galvanize stronger action from all people, but then the question still remains. Now, there are no existing global frameworks when it comes to decision making. So, for instance, who sets the target? Who presses the button and says that, hey, we're ready, let's deploy? We don't have any governance frameworks that talks exclusively about that. Now, there are also conflict potentials that may arise that also brings about some uncertainty and would result in risk. Now, the issue about optimal temperature could spark some international tension because, for instance, if you go to the global north, they are used to a certain temperature, optimal temperature conditions. If you come to the global south, it is the same. Now, when there are alterations and the temperature alterations results in discomfort, it becomes difficult, for instance. Uh, and then you're likely to have disagreements because if there are no universal frameworks that are agreed onto that deployment, and probably the modeling also has not envisaged what effects they are likely to bring. We would lock in technology at some point, but then, if we start deployment, it will be difficult to stop because we would want to improve upon whatever we've done. So, okay, we noticed that this is happening. Let's improve it this way. So, oh, we've noticed that that is something we can resolve. So we go about and do that. So on the governance and then the political side, there needs to be some political will at the state level, at the governance level, regionally and globally, to look at all these issues about who should start, who should fund, who should control, who are going to be the major beneficiaries, who are going to be uh, the sufferers, quote and unquote. Now, we talk about the issue of social risk. Look, we cannot overemphasize the fact that there will be inequitable impacts when it comes to the effect of SRM. Obviously, the harms and the benefits may fall differently on the rich and the poor. Those who probably may have the funding, may have the money, would be able to put in place some other mechanisms to hold the effect. Now, regional agricultural changes may be influenced. So, as I mentioned earlier, food systems, especially in the global south, may be affected. It would have a number of health implications. We'll begin to see emerging infectious diseases. We'll begin to see diseases. One of the things that we are observing currently in a study I am conducting with a couple of friends is on heat stress, where we are realizing that a lot of the people that are exposed to heat stress have some debilitating conditions, or they develop some debilitating conditions where some of their internal organs are unable to function properly over time. And these are all effects from the climate, from the atmosphere. Air quality has become a problem, especially in the global south, because we're not cutting down on our carbon emissions and things like that. Now, there's also that talk about the power asymmetry between the global north and then the global south. As we speak, a lot of the funding that is going into SRM research, even the socio-political and the ethical governance research is funded by the Global North. And this poses some risk. And you and I know that when you're funded, your funders usually would have targets and they would have deliverables that are predetermined even before the funding is given. So you're not likely to be able to control what the outcomes of your research would be because they are predetermined during the application for the fund. Now, this brings to mind the risk benefit matrix. For instance, we need to understand what the high risk are and the ones we should be concerned about. You see, one of the major risks would be a termination shock. So we begin this and then we realize that, oh, we're not getting the kind of effect we want. We want to end it at some point. What effects would it bring? Now, the other high risk issue has to do with governance failure, where there are no frameworks to envisage the risk, monitor the risk, and mitigate the risk when it happens. The moral hazard issues are there, Um, people who rely solely on the climate, what effect would it have on them, their livelihood? A lot of people across the global south depend solely on that. So we put all of that into the high risk zone because these are issues we need to deal with. Now, what it means is that for me personally, with my background and the work I have done on risk and regulation, I would rank all of these as immediate issues that should be flagged for discussion when it comes to the issue of SRM and what Africa must do. There are quite a number of them that may be of minor concerns, technical glitches here and there. I mean, we will learn, we would fine tune the system, it would work. Academic disagreements may happen. It does happen all the time. So we're not so much concerned about that. Now, one of the things that socially we need to also avert our minds to is about the public. Now, SRM becomes an innovative product that needs to look at satisfying the public. So the public interest in this discussion cannot be overemphasized. But the public is us, is you and I on this call. And when the public fully understands, when the public is informed, the opposition that usually you would see that arises when there's an introduction of an innovation may not be there. So this is something we can manage. We can manage the controversies from the various research works, the funding disputes. We can manage them. We can manage the media misinformation, disinformation, and the likes. We can handle that. So those are not issues that we'll prioritize when it comes to our risk benefit matrix. Now, there may be some other severe ones that are less likely to occur. For instance, when we deploy, there may be some catastrophic regional shifts that may result in some conflict. If there are conflicts, we know there are conflict resolution processes, so we can manage that. Mass species extinction, yes. Now, what we're doing is to grow some of or protect some of this extinct or near extinct species in one way or the other. We're trying to improve the biodiversity, we're trying to improve that ecosystem and all of that. So there are quite a number of things we can do when it comes to understanding the risk benefit matrix that should inform the approach that we should use when we want to have discussions on SRM and its impact on Africa. So clearly, from this matrix, you realize that there are quite a number of high probable impact risk that we should avert our minds to. Again, the governance challenges are there up there because we need to understand what we're dealing with. We need to be able to get enough information so we can make informed decision. We need to apprise ourselves properly about the potential risk that that deployment could bring. And that is where the governance frameworks come in. And as we speak, there are no existing frameworks to manage this risk, which is why we think that Africa should be part of the discussion because we become the biggest or the major people who would suffer from this if it does happen. Now, when you talk about governance, you also need to avert your mind to the ethical implications. Now, in our paper authored by Kwesi, myself, and our colleague, we talked about distributive justice and how that also lends itself to the whole conversation about governance when it comes to SRM. You see, colleagues, who would bear the risk and who would bear the benefit when we deploy SRM? That question is not answered. Nobody's answering that. Now, SRM effects may have global impact, but the decisions that will lead to its deployment must be made by people. And it is likely that it is only a few people that are going to be making that decision. Now, that is averse to the concept of distributive justice, because you need to bring all the players together so that people can speak up for themselves and say that, yes, we like this innovative product, we like this innovation, but is it possible to look at it in this vein? Is it possible to look at it in that vein? There is also the issue of procedural justice as to who decides whether to deploy SRM or not. As we speak, and I mentioned earlier on, there are no frameworks when it comes to SRM deployment and all of that. So, for instance, the Global South, where we envisage that a lot of the effects would occur, would have legitimate concerns about how the deployment should be done, who is going to deploy it, what effects it would have on them. And that is what we should be building into our governance frameworks when it comes to this innovation. Beyond a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, do we have any idea what the intergenerational equity would look like? You and I probably may not be here, but what effects the deployment of SRM could have on the generations yet unborn? These are questions that we need to look at. So these are ethical issues that we need to avert our minds to. So the power symmetry becomes very important because governance discussions usually are dominated by the global north because they have the funding, and the global south is sitting back, and we are the ones who are likely to experience the impact. So there is also this conversation about technological imposition by the global north onto the global south. Look, we have the money, we have the technology to do this. If we do it, you would benefit, but there will be some collateral damage at some point. You know what? We'll try as much as we can to help you to solve whatever problems would emanate from that. Those discussions haven't started yet, but the potential that those discussions could start also does exist. So these are a few ethical issues when it comes to distributive justice, intergenerational equity, procedural justice, and the risk of, colonialism, which is something I know a lot of people don't want to talk about, they don't want to hear, but these are real issues that we need to look at. Now, this borders on the public interest, and it is very important that we avert our minds to them. Now, one other thing, when it comes to the indigenous rights, here we're talking about the people themselves. For instance, people who depend on the climate should be free and not coerced in the decision-making process. They should be informed. So that information will be based on what knowledge they have on SRM. Now, if you look at the concept of informed consent, what it means is that the individual should have enough information. The individual should understand the information and use the information in the decision-making. Now, if you dial this to the community level, the communities that depend on the climate, the countries that depend on the climate, it means that they need to know about the potential risk and the potential benefits. Do a risk-benefit analysis so they can enter into conversations and agreements. That becomes very, very important. Now, the core question that has been asked about this moral hazard is that would the SRM research, the deployment and all of that, undermine political will for mitigation? Countries are trying to cut emissions. So we increase taxes on products that increase emission. We attempt to make sure that we have a target set for ourselves. But the question that a lot of people are asking is this: the moment we begin to deploy SRM, would nation states be relaxed about that approach? Now, remember, we've said earlier on that the whole concept of SRM would not eliminate the need for loss and damage mechanisms. So even when we deploy SRM, the impact may be there and some communities may be vulnerable. And that is where the issues of compensations and all those things may have to be discussed. There are people who are optimistic about it. There are people who are pessimistic about it. It could work, it could not work, but the data, the evidence, the information would show. What do we need to do? We need a decision framework for SRM. And here I'm going to propose 4 major frameworks that we need to consider. Number 1, we need to use the precautionary principle. You see, when risks are imminent, where we do not know, where there are uncertainties, where there is the absence of full scientific certainty that this may happen, this may not happen, then we need to take that precaution. Now, that precaution would help us develop the appropriate governance frameworks to mitigate the risk, monitor the risk, and clear them as and when they occur. Now, the other framework that we need to look at when it comes to SRM would be equitable participation. What do we need? We need meaningful representation from all the people, not only the people who have the financial capital to deploy this. No. Meaningful representation would include even communities and individuals that would be affected. So in developing the governance framework, we go down to the individuals, we go down to the communities, we go down to the people who will be affected and have conversations. So the decisions about whether we should work with this or we should not take up this innovation or that would not happen and should not happen without extensive consultation of the people. So no decisions about Global South without the Global South. In the Global South, and you see, even within the Global South, we need to have very frank conversations to the micro level, and that is the people who will be directly affected. So the ordinary farmer in the village, the ordinary person who cultivates crops, the ordinary person who does fish farming, and all of that. These are people we need to have conversations with in developing the framework, the governance framework for SRM. We need to ensure transparency. So the research output would have to be open. We need open governance. We need to have open debate, open conversations, and that is why I am happy to be part of this. You see, everything around SRM, in terms of research, I know there's been a lot of work that is being done on climate modeling and all of that. You know, there are quite a number of publications out there. There have been meetings here and there. We need to encourage debate, conversations, let people ask questions, let us understand what the public interest is, and include that in the development of the governance framework. The 4th one I would recommend is the issue of reversibility. We need to look for approaches that can be stopped without consequences. So in whatever scientific modeling attempts that are being done and all of that, if we deploy this innovative product, we need to think about what if it doesn't work and we want to revert? Would it have consequences? Now, we don't want to get locked into the technology and then it becomes irreversible. And then we have issues, we don't have solutions. And then we find ourselves wanting because we've started something we cannot control, we cannot mitigate. No. These are conversations that we should have that should go into the frameworks that will be developed. So, in all of this, the decision-making approach should be such that the governance framework must precede any attempt to deploy whatever innovative product that we are developing. You see, that framework would put in measures that would say that, okay, we have enough evidence on this, we have enough evidence on that. Now we can allow person A or country A, country B to begin, and then we can allow you to follow. We can allow this person to follow because we don't want to start it for the entire world at the same time. No. So even the deployment strategies would have to go into the development of the framework. And it is important that we use this approach. Now, we need to map the governance landscape. Unfortunately, whilst I was trying to put this together, I became a bit sad because I looked at a number of legislative and regulatory documents, and I noticed that none of them was very specific to SRM. So there are no binding international treaties on SRM. What it means is that as it stands now, anybody at all can decide to proceed, and there are no treaties, there are no governance frameworks that stops anybody from doing so, whether the effects are there or not. Now, there are quite a number of frameworks that mentions SRM to an extent, but it's not explicit. So UNFCCC talks about a number of things, but not very explicit when it comes to SRM. So you look at all that, the UNEA discussed it at their meeting, but no resolution was adopted as to whether Africa should be ready, what we should do, and all of that. The IPCC, talks about the science, So there's a lot of information on the science, but again, no governance frameworks have been designed. Now, I looked around and I realized that even for a lot of countries in the global south, they have documents on climate interventions and things like that, but nothing specific on SRM. So the governance gaps usually would be in the enforcement mechanisms because the frameworks do not exist. There again are no global south representations in any of these frameworks that somehow, some way talks about SRM. There are no research governance standards. There are no dispute resolution processes that have been outlined to say that, look, should this happen and another person suffers, this is how we're going to manage that dispute. There are gaps. Now, these institutional gaps should inform what governance initiatives we should be thinking about. So, for instance, the Oxford Principles talks about 5 things. It talks about transparency, public participation, independent assessment, governance before deployment, and all of that. These have been referenced widely, but again, they're not binding. Now, what I am happy about is that in Africa, we're beginning to have conversations about SRM. So the ministers at their meeting called for solar geoengineering non-agreement. in an attempt to reject SRM as a climate solution and calling on the UN General Assembly to resolve this. But that was where it ended. Now it was a position they took, but it's ended there. I mean, it's not being carried forward. There are critical gaps in the timelines from the 1977, where it was first mentioned, where the issue of climate modification was first mentioned till now, where, there's been a number of things that have been done. But again, there are no binding treaties when it comes to SRM. So if you look at the governance architecture, number one, internationally, there's nothing that binds anybody when it comes to SRM research or deployment. There are no enforcement mechanisms for even soft laws on restrictions. The Global South representation is not there, but I'm happy that discussions are ongoing. I see a number of scientists, I see a number of people becoming interested, and I can see that on this call. There are no dispute resolution processes for conflicts that may arise, and these are critical gaps that should go into the development, or that should be considered when developing the governance framework. Having done that, who are the people who should make the decision? So we'll start with the government. The scientists should be there. Private sector should be part of the decision-making process. CSOs, philanthropic organizations, civil society, the indigenous communities, they should be part of this conversation because they would be the people who will be most affected by climate change. So when we are developing the governance frameworks, we should make sure that the indigenous people are properly and adequately represented. Now, on the international scale, Global South must be represented. The youth must be represented. Remember, earlier on, I did mention the fact that when we deploy SRM, for instance, we do not know what will happen in a decade, 2 decades, 3, 4, on and on and on and on. It will be good to involve the youth in the discussion. It will be good for them to know, it will be good for them to be part of the decision-making process so they can own it. So the stakeholder ecosystem, when it comes to developing the governance framework for SRM, should include all these people. Now, let me also mention, colleagues, that you see, in all of this, our climate is the most vulnerable when it comes to SRM. I talked about heat stress a bit earlier, talked about food insecurity, I talked about water scarcity, climate migration, disease burden. It would have a huge impact on our economy. This is something we cannot overemphasize. So what do we do? Now, regionally, I looked at the data on what the climate intervention may look like in terms of its impact on the regional blocks. In West Africa and in my beloved country, Ghana, when it rains for 24 hours, it floods. I'm sure a lot of us saw on the news how devastating the floods were a couple of days ago. Now, if we're disrupting the environment, if we're introducing an innovation into the climate, and it would have effects, is this likely to exacerbate some of the things that I have indicated here? Would it affect food security? In East Africa, we're looking at increasing flood drought cycles. A number of things are happening. Northern Africa is experiencing extreme heat. Southern Africa is experiencing water stress. There's biodiversity loss in Southern Africa. These are things that are happening. Central Africa is experiencing rainforest degradation because of the changing precipitation patterns. So there are quite a number of things, and you see, all of this depends on the climate. So the stakes for you and I having these conversations could not be higher. Whatever we do with SRM would affect all of us. And it will be important for all of the global south to take part in this discussion to see. So Africa must be at the table. Africa must be the one leading the discussion because we would be most affected. For the leadership, for those of us who are on this call who are in leadership, let us avert our minds to climate justice. I talked earlier on about distributive justice. Let us make sure that whatever we sign up for, whatever we agree on, is fair and equitable to all. Let us make sure that you see over the 1.4 billion people are properly represented anytime there's a discussion on the climate. Diplomatically, let's use our weight to engage and have outcomes that would be in the public interest of the global south. To do this, we need to build capacity. We cannot continue to develop on expertise from global north. We cannot continue to depend on funding from global north to solve our problems in the global south. No. African governments must make a conscious effort to make funding available for research and development. We need to encourage a lot more people to participate in the SRM discourse. I was very happy when one of my students sent me an email when I mentioned in class about this innovation and the paper we had published. After reading the paper, said that, look, I'm thinking about a research proposal on this in my specialty area. Something I had not averted my mind to. But when he mentioned it, when I read the mail, I was so happy that yes, somebody is looking at the effect of SRM on some other systems. We need to improve our technology. Colleagues, you see, in the paper we wrote, and I like this statement from the paper. We said, look, a technology that alters the sun cannot be governed responsibly if it excludes the region whose economies and livelihoods depend so deeply on the readings of the rain. It's as simple as that, colleagues. This is why we have to take the lead and initiate the discussions on SRM. We have a comparative advantage, and there are quite a number of them. Our research institutions are growing. There's a lot of young scientists up and coming. You know, there's a lot of drive when it comes to renewable energy leadership. Africa CDC is demonstrating that Africa can build world-class governance systems and institutions if we want to. The African Development Bank is shown over the period that, yes, they have the financial and technical capacity for climate governance. They need to make the funding available for the research. There are a number of regional organizations. The infrastructure is there. The African Climate Intervention Research Hub was launched recently, and I would encourage as many of us who are on this call who will be interested in joining this hub to do so. We have a number of institutions, we have a number of talents. You know, sometimes you sit back and you look at all the people who conduct the high-end research for the global north, and then you see Africans, and then you ask yourself, so what are we doing to our own? Can we import our, sometimes when I use the word import, our own people, these are our people. What would it take for us to bring them back home to do these things? We need to enable them. So we have a lot of assets that we can use to build our governance leadership when it comes to SRM. And this is something we should do. Our institutional landscapes are there. There are quite a number of them. I'll share the slides with you. The African Union, the African Ministerial Conference on Environment, they're doing quite a lot. African Climate Foundation, all of them, the investees, all of them, they are doing quite a lot. I think that we need to leverage on that. Let me propose the governance pathway for Africa. You see, there are 4 things that are likely to happen. Number one, we can decide to be a passive observer. We'll wait for others to develop the governance, and then we go and then borrow. The risk is that the decisions will be made without our input and we'll suffer. The other scenario is that we can be reactive. So when people put money into research, when they fund research and all of that, and then we see the findings, then we become reactive. So you realize that we become very defensive. We do not really understand because we do not have the information. We do not have the technical know-how. That is what is likely to happen. Now, between 1 and 2, that is what our state looks like now. But thankfully, we're beginning to shift from 1 and 2 to 3 and 4, where we're becoming strategic negotiators because we are making our voices heard. So we are actively participating in governance frameworks. Now, when we begin to talk at all levels, we begin to speak at all levels on these issues, it gives us leverage to become a global leader. So we now become the people who drive the conversation when it comes to SRM. My recommendation is that we build on the existing frameworks. We make sure that we support, we make sure that we develop African-led research capacity. We make sure that whatever governance frameworks we need are developed rather than only responding to proposals from others. We need to begin the engagement at the community. That engagement should inform the things that we want to put into our framework. What do we need? We need to build capacity. We need to build our human resource capacity. There are quite a number of scientists that are into climate modeling. I think they are not enough. We need to improve our atmospheric science. People would go to the university and prefer to study some other programs because they don't find atmospheric science interesting. But sometimes when you sit back to look at the whole concept of atmospheric science and you ask yourself, do we really know the impact of this? A lot of us are happy when the rains come and then it subsides and then we have some sun and we see all those beautiful plants sprouting and all of that. We're happy. But whatever happens in terms of the effect is something we do not have our minds to. But this is an area we need to focus on. Our universities and training institutions should help build capacity in that. We need to build capacity in ethics and governance. We need a lot more people like you on this call to take up the ethical issues and the governance issues on SRM. We need to train negotiators who would now go on the international stage and negotiate on behalf of Global South and Africa on SRM. We cannot do any of these things without engaging the public. But more importantly, we need to fund research. We need to secure dedicated funding opportunities for SRM research because it affects all of us. Public engagement should be very inclusive. It should be transparent. Let's involve the media. Let the citizens participate. Let's look at all the risk communication strategies and try as much as we can to vet them. Sweden has a very good lesson, The Sweden Scopex consultation process, what they did was that they had meaningful engagements that made good use of time and resources. Now, what they did was they made sure that the consultations were low level and it included everybody that needed to be included. We need to invest in public engagement processes before we take decisions on SRM. In Africa, we like to sit in the boardroom, in the cities, in the capital, and take decisions and expect those in the communities to implement them. We need to shy away from that. We need to change that approach. This is what is going to happen. There's a high risk if deployment is done without our participation. Now, if we sit and we do not participate, it will hit agriculture, there will be harm, we may be colonized by technology and all of that. Now, the other scenario is that, yes, we may have a regional governance, but the different rules in different regions may apply. And so that fragmentation will lead to some conflict. There may be inconsistent standards that may not be applicable. So when you move from one jurisdiction to the other, you realize that things are done differently. But remember, the cross-border effects would be so enormous to attempt to deal with. The other thing would be that, okay, there's a global treaty with equity to which we have participated, to which we have contributed. Our voices are heard. The documents and the frameworks that are developed become binding. They are properly enforced. Research is regulated and all of that. The African Ministerial Conference on the Environment has a position. The moratorium on a non-use agreement, this is something we need to also look at. We need to build our governance frameworks around this. Colleagues, let me recommend a few things. So for our African stakeholders, the government, African Union, researchers, partners, you and I, we need to develop a national position on SRM. We need to invest in research, engage actively in international forum. We need to fund climate modeling for regional impacts. African Union should start thinking about formalizing continental SRM positions. We need to create an AU SRM expert panel and start the discussions now. We have to establish regional research coordination hubs. We need to lead the non-use agreement diplomacy and get it onto the international level. For the researchers, my recommendations will be that let us pursue African-led research agenda. We need to publish in accessible formats. It's important because a lot of the times, we go ahead and do the publications and all of that, and it becomes inaccessible. Sometimes we publish and then we forget that the decision maker, the policy maker, does not have time to go and read that entire manuscript that has been published. We need to start thinking about policy briefs and media engagement and public engagement and disseminating our research findings. We need to understand what our priorities are as Africans and use that to drive whatever knowledge that we need. So for the African Union, we need to convene the AU high-level panel on SRM governance. I would recommend that we do that within the next 12 months. We need to establish the ACRH. We need to develop a common position on SRM. We need to create avenues for capacity building, and we need to lead a coalition for non-use agreement at the UN General Assembly. For our international partners and the international community, let us ensure that there's equitable representation. Let us support responsible research. Let all stakeholders prioritize mitigation and adaptation. Let civil societies continue to advocate for climate justice. And I want to use the opportunity to thank the Degrees Initiative. They have done well. They funded about 150 plus scientists in 22 developing countries to model SRM impact. While this is commendable, while this is valuable, the question still remains, what are we doing as Africa? We should move from being an observer to being a co-designer of global SRM governance. Our future of solar radiation management governance should not be decided for Africa. It must be decided by Africa. It must be shaped with Africa. Whatever innovations that we're looking at should have equitable governance. So we need to claim Africa's seat at the table. We need to build capacity, shape governance, and lead the conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, I go back to this quote to say that a technology that alters the sun cannot be governed responsibly if it excludes the region whose economies and livelihoods depend so deeply on the rhythms of the rain. Africa cannot afford to watch from the sidelines. This is the time to take to the field. This is the time to feel responsible. This is the time to put in the needed measures to develop the appropriate governance frameworks when it comes to SRM. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Essien, for this wonderful presentation. I think this is one of the most, if not the top, most governance and ethics presentation that I've been to. Colleagues and friends, I'll open the floor up for questions. I am looking through our chat and to see if we have a couple of. Okay, so I'll take Sari's questions. She says that, please, could you clarify? Does AMSEN call for non-use cover deployment of technologies only or include potential restrictions on research? Okay, I think Vida also tried to provide some answers to that, but I'll leave that to Prof to elaborate further. Sari wants to know whether AMSEN call for non-use of the deployment of technologies only, or does it include potential restrictions on research? Thank you.
So the call initially was looking at technologies. Very little talk was made on potential restrictions for research, but it's come up in a number of conversations. We looked at the pros and cons of that. What would be the public interest in restrictions on research? Now, the question that a lot of people have asked is this: should we not rather engage in understanding what the issues are, and so encourage research rather than restrict it? These were a few of the things that came up, but what the position was at the time was on the deployment. The non-use agreement was on the deployment, not restrictions on research. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for clarifying that. I think Ernest and Vida also provided extra context on that. And to get the conversation rolling, Professor, I wanted to ask that much of your career has actually focused on vaccine regulation and pharmacovigilance and health governance. I would want to ask what lessons from these fields can be applied to the governance of global climate intervention, such as SRM, and where do the comparisons break down?
Right. So my lessons from governance of innovation basically looks at two major things. Definition of uncertainties, definition of risk. And this cuts across every innovative product. So whether in climate, in health, in business, in humanities and social sciences, what is important is first of all to define your risk, especially when you are sure that there are uncertainties when it comes to the innovation that you are looking at. Now, once that uncertainty is clear and you are able to define what potential risk that uncertainty should or would bring, then the next thing would be for you to be able to develop the appropriate governance framework for that innovation. You see, the truth is this, we've advanced the course of knowledge over the years. We've changed a number of things over the years. We've improved upon systems over the years. We are not going to stop innovations today. We are not going to stop innovations tomorrow. We will continue to innovate because innovations improve our lives. It makes things easier for us. But what we need to do is that whilst we are innovating, we need to make sure that we understand what we are innovating, we develop the appropriate governance frameworks to manage the unintended and unassumed consequences of that innovative product. So this cuts across in everything and not just in climate science. I would just encourage all of us that, yes, let us continue to innovate, but whilst we do so, let us always avert our minds to making sure that that innovation begins with understanding whatever uncertainties there may be and whatever risk that may be there, and then we develop the appropriate governance frameworks for that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I think that is pretty clear. I think there's one more question that I would want to read. It says, you mentioned that the inclusion of indigenous knowledge. Are there any examples of that being done well in fields where research is focused on models? Or what might good practice look like for SRM as the field moves to outdoor experiments?
So as the field moves to outdoor experiments, the next thing would be for us to focus on engaging people at the micro level. And this is where I talk about including the indigenous people in the conversation. For instance, if you go to the ordinary peasant farmer, they are able to tell you the effects of the climate on their livelihood. You're able to have conversations about the changes in weather patterns, how it affects their yield, the quality of their yields, and all of that. Now, you would have a very good understanding of what the impact of climate change is at that micro level. Then you can now escalate that conversation to the entire community and look at the community dynamics, how people are living when it comes to the impact of the climate. When there are floods, when there are droughts, how do these people live? What other interventions have been put in place to avert some of these things? So we talk about issues of food security and all of that. At the micro level, how are they affected? Now, when we understand all of this, and we are talking about an innovation that has the potential to impact on their livelihood, then we get a very good understanding of what the actual impact would be like. So the indigenous knowledge comes in where, at the micro level, these people are able to tell you that, look, when this happens, this is what happens to the biodiversity in our community. Now, when it happens this way, it takes this much time for it to be reversed, or it is not reversed at all. Some of that may not come through modeling, and that is why the engagement should go down to that level. So you can pick up all that information that can also be fed into whatever modeling is being done. So we can have a very good picture of what the impact of the innovation would be like. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. There is a question, but I will deal with that. I think it's Michael asking that he has a political science background, but highly interested in atmospheric science. Where and how can he fit into this important conversation? I think the interest necessarily does not have to be in atmospheric science, Michael. It has to be on sort of the climate intervention discussion that we are doing. Atmospheric science is very broad, and I don't think you want to go to another school learning atmospheric science, but how to engage with your background in political science in this discussion. I've shared a link with you. Could you please follow up on that? And there's another question. It says, could our participation in this dialogue inadvertently provide cover for ineffective policies, ultimately delaying the urgent, systematic action required to cut emissions? Over to you, Professor.
Yes, I mean, this is a very good start. Now we're having this dialogue. It's a very good beginning to look at conversations about emissions, cutting emissions, and all of that. We need to have a conversation about the climate, and we need a lot more of such public engagements. And I'm happy to participate in any of them. Ernest, if we could have maybe monthly conversations on some of these issues, and not look only at innovative products, not only look at SRM, but we look at the whole issue of the climate. It will be very helpful. I know sometimes there are conversations about political will and interest when it comes to conversations around the climate, and commitment by political actors to some of the discussions and some of the resolutions that we make. But what I would say largely is that such conversations would set the agenda and will cut the attention of the needed policymakers to know that there's this discussion going on, and a lot of people are beginning to talk about this. And that is where we'll get their attention and be able to drum home whatever we need to drum home. And so, yes, for me, I think that we need to start the conversations on the climate. We started with a lot of energy, with a lot of enthusiasm. It died down, but we need to wake that up and then continue. It shouldn't be only about SRM, but we should look at the conversation on the entirety of the issue of the climate and then the innovations that we're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I think that our time is far up, and I would like to say a big thank you to you for this wonderful presentation, and to our colleagues who were able to join in this discussion, this webinar. We appreciate the time and effort that they've put in to be here. And thanks to ECF for also organizing this. And we appreciate that the topic was very interesting and captivated us all through the 1 hour and 10 minutes presentation. Without much ado, I'll say a very big thank you to everybody for making this webinar a success. Thanks to Taylor for moderating initially. And we hope to keep this rolling. You hear from us on the next webinar that we have scheduled. And let's keep the fire burning. Green regards to everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.